I hadn't returned to my family's home in years, not out of necessity, but by choice. The village, tucked between dense forests and winding paths, was a place I once found comforting. Now it was smothered by an eerie quiet, a silence that seemed to hang too heavy for a night meant to be spent with loved ones. The road to my parents' house was uncharacteristically empty. All the lights in neighboring homes were dim, as if the world itself had surrendered to an unsettling darkness. As I approached the familiar cottage, my mother stood in the doorway, her face washed in an unusual pallor under the faint glow of a candle. Behind her, I could see the dining room filled with familiar faces, each frozen in a moment I couldn't yet place. It felt strange, seeing everyone together again like this, with a strange, unspoken knowledge shared amongst them. My father welcomed me with his usual stoic nod, and my brother, Martin, who had moved to the city years ago, offered a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. It seemed as if each of us carried an invisible weight, a shared understanding that nothing could be quite right in this moment. As I took my seat at the table, I couldn't help but notice the abundance of food laid out before us. More than enough for a celebration, though the atmosphere around us was anything but joyous. Mother spoke first, her voice soft, yet laced with an urgency I'd never heard before. She reminded us, somewhat cryptically, of the importance of togetherness, how families like ours would have to face the world as one. No one met her eyes. Instead, each of us stared at our plates, as though entranced by the stillness of the scene before us. Then, as if on cue, she started to serve the dishes, moving with the quiet precision of someone who had practiced this ritual countless times. As I began to eat, I noticed my sister, Margaret, fidgeting nervously. Her gaze flitted between us, and I sensed she was holding back, wanting to speak but fearful of the words trapped in her throat. I looked around the table. Everyone else seemed to sense it too, and though the danger we faced lay beyond the walls of our home, creeping closer with each passing hour, it was our own family's guarded secrets that now felt most threatening. Before the main course could even be served, Margaret finally spoke, her voice cutting through the silence. "I need to say something. Something I've kept hidden for too long." She stopped, her words trailing off as a low groan echoed from the distance outside. We all paused, straining to listen. There it was again, a sound unmistakably human yet inhumanly hollow, growing louder as it approached our door. It was enough to remind us of the urgency Mother had spoken of, a reminder that our last meal together might indeed be just that. The sound outside faded, leaving behind a tense, brittle silence. We sat there, each of us clutching a fragment of whatever peace we could muster. I couldn't look directly at Margaret. Her face, normally pale, now looked almost ghostly in the candlelight, casting shadows across her features. She'd always been the quiet one, the one with secrets she held close, but never like this. There was a stillness to her now, like she was preparing to say something that could shift the ground beneath us all. Mother continued to serve the food, ladling soup with a peculiar, mechanical efficiency. Her movements were so precise, so deliberate. It seemed as though she was trying to distract herself from something too vast and dark to face. My father looked on, his gaze hollow, as though the woman before him was a stranger he was too polite to question. He'd been this way for years, distant, locked in an invisible struggle he never allowed us to witness. I wondered if, in that moment, he could sense that whatever he'd feared might be closing in around us. Finally, Margaret broke the silence again, her voice barely rising above a murmur. "Do you remember last autumn? The whispers about the sickness?" about people who changed. She glanced around the table, as though daring us to meet her gaze. No one did. We all knew what she meant. Stories had crept through the village about strange sightings in the fields, figures stumbling at the edges of the forest, a sickness that dulled the eyes, drained the color from faces, and left people moving with the eerie, mindless purpose of sleepwalkers. No one spoke openly of it, but the rumors lived in hushed tones, murmured by firesides and in the creaking shadows of empty streets. It was the sort of thing our parents would call nonsense, the kind of dread we were meant to keep at bay with simple denials and closed doors. I saw one of them, Margaret continued, her voice trembling as she twisted her napkin. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't unsee it. I watched them moving through the trees, as if they were drawn to something. A chill crept over the room. I noticed Martin shift uneasily, his fork clattering against his plate. He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. We've all been hearing things, he said, though he didn't sound convinced. But Margaret only shook her head. It wasn't the light. It was real. They're real. She looked straight at me, her eyes wide, pleading. And they're coming closer. As her words sank in, the light from the candles seemed to flicker, casting strange shadows across the walls. Each of us was still, frozen by the weight of something unspoken that hung in the air. Outside, another faint noise drifted through the night, almost like a rustling, subtle, persistent, and entirely too close. It was then that Mother, in her quiet, controlled manner, set down her spoon and took a deep breath. She looked at us, one by one, with an expression I could only describe as resignation. "We have to finish our meal," she said, her voice steady but tight. "After that, we'll make preparations." Father looked at her with an expression bordering on defiance, as though he'd just realized he had no idea who this woman beside him truly was. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, he returned to his food, each bite deliberate, as if the act itself could hold back the unknown pressing at the walls. And so we sat, each of us unwilling to break the silence that had settled over us like a shroud. We ate in near darkness, only the soft clinking of utensils breaking the heavy, fearful stillness. None of us dared to say what we were all thinking, that whatever was coming for us was already here. The meal carried on, each course feeling heavier than the last. We were bound by a strange, silent pact, each of us moving mechanically, unwilling to be the first to shatter the frail illusion of normalcy that Mother so carefully maintained. Margaret's words, however, lingered over the table like smoke, curling through each of our minds as we chewed in forced, somber silence. As the plates emptied, I noticed my mother's hands trembling ever so slightly as she poured tea, her gaze fixed on a point beyond any of us. The tension in her face told me she was listening, to the slight groans of the walls, to the rustle of leaves beyond the window, to the faint and distant sounds that seemed to edge closer with each heartbeat. Martin finally broke the silence, though his voice sounded hoarse, distant. "So, we just sit here, then?" His question was directed to no one in particular, though we all felt its weight. "Are we going to wait for them to just come through the door?" My father glanced sharply at him, an unspoken warning in his eyes, but Martin didn't flinch. Perhaps, like the rest of us, he was finally tired of pretending, of swallowing his fear and anger like so much stale bread. He set his teacup down with a loud clink, the noise almost jarring in the otherwise stifling silence. Margaret looked at him with a mixture of sorrow and something else, something darker, more raw. "It doesn't matter if we wait or if we run," she said softly. "Once they have their sights on you, it's only a matter of time." Her words were laced with a grim acceptance that none of us wanted to acknowledge, yet somehow we all understood. Mother cleared her throat delicately, as if to dispel the heavy silence that had settled again. "Perhaps we should focus on what we can control," she said, her tone as practical as if she were discussing the weather. "After all, we've faced other hardships before, haven't we?" Her eyes moved around the table, lingering on each of us in turn. I had to look away, unable to bear the intensity of her gaze. Yet I couldn't ignore the odd tremor in her voice, the slight falter that betrayed her resolve. It occurred to me that perhaps she, too, was hiding something, harboring secrets she would never dare reveal. Secrets about the strange sounds in the woods, about the unspoken agreement that brought us together tonight. I looked at my father, who sat in stony silence, his eyes fixed firmly on his plate. He hadn't spoken much the entire evening, and I wondered if he knew something the rest of us didn't. His face was etched with lines of worry and fatigue, as though he had been carrying a burden for years, a weight that, tonight, seemed ready to crush him. And then, with a suddenness that startled us all, he spoke. His voice was a low, unfamiliar rumble, as if dredged up from some forgotten depth. "They're not the only things to fear," he muttered, almost to himself. "What waits inside these walls is no less dangerous than what's outside." The room fell silent again, each of us staring at him in shock. But he said nothing more, returning to his tea with a steady, deliberate sip. It was a statement left to hang in the air, its meaning thick and impenetrable, an unspoken accusation directed as much at himself as at the rest of us. For the first time that evening, I felt a chill, not from the thought of what lurked beyond our door, but from the realization that, perhaps, the greatest danger was not out there at all. Perhaps it had been seated with us all along, woven into our family, waiting patiently to unravel in the darkness of this final meal. The heaviness of Father's words settled like dust on an old book, untouched yet thick and suffocating. Each of us felt it, a tightening around the heart, a pulling at the edges of some buried memory that none dared to bring into the light. His silence spoke louder than any confession. It was as if, for years, he'd carried something too painful to bear, a secret he'd walled away in his heart, only to let it seep out now, in our final hour. Margaret lowered her eyes to her empty plate, her face contorted in an expression I couldn't place. It was fear, yes, but also something more, something like shame, though I couldn't say for what. She ran a finger along the edge of her knife, a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to calm her. "I knew it," she whispered at last, almost too softly to hear. "I always knew something was wrong with this family." Her gaze flickered to Mother, but she quickly looked away, her shoulders hunched, as if she were bracing herself against an unseen blow. Mother straightened, her expression unreadable. Her face, usually so composed, seemed strained, as if the mask she wore had started to crack. "There is no wrong, Margaret," she said, her voice low but firm. "We are bound together, and in times like these, that bond is all we have." But Margaret only shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. "A bond," she repeated, her voice laced with a bitter laugh. "Is that what you call it? This silence, these secrets? This house itself is a prison, and you know it. I just never realized how tightly we were locked in." A heavy silence followed, each of us stunned by her outburst. Mother's eyes, however, held a flicker of something, hurt, yes, but also a strange, unyielding defiance. She looked around the table, her gaze settling on each of us as if daring us to share in Margaret's accusations. I found myself unable to meet her eyes. Father finally spoke, his voice as calm as if he were commenting on the weather. "Perhaps Margaret is right," he said, each word deliberate and measured. "We've all chosen to ignore certain truths, and maybe it's time we stopped." He paused, his hand resting on the table, fingers tapping slowly, as if to some rhythm only he could hear. "After all," he continued, "if this is our last meal, then what good is holding on to lies?" The words hung in the air, settling heavily on each of us. I could feel my heart pounding, a dread rising in me that went beyond the dangers lurking outside our walls. It was as if I were standing on the edge of some terrible revelation, one that I didn't want to see but couldn't look away from. And then Mother, with a strange calmness, began to speak. "There are things you don't understand," she said, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable note of warning. "Choices we made for your sake." She looked at each of us in turn, her gaze unwavering. "To protect you, protect us from what?" Martin asked, his voice thick with skepticism. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Mother's expression softened, a strange sadness creeping into her eyes. "From ourselves," she replied quietly, as if that answer alone held the weight of years. Her gaze lingered on Father, and in that moment, something seemed to pass between them, something wordless yet undeniable. A bond forged not in love, but in a shared burden that had taken root in silence and shadows. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across their faces, and in the dim light, they looked almost like strangers, bound together by something dark and unspoken. My hands felt cold, a chill creeping up my spine as I realized the depth of what lay beneath their quiet, controlled facades. For the first time, I felt as if I didn't know my own family at all. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Margaret asked the question we had all been dreading. "What have you done?" The words seemed to echo through the room, lingering in the thick silence that followed. We all sat motionless, as if frozen by some invisible hand, unwilling or unable to acknowledge the question Margaret had dared to ask. Yet her words hung over us, pressing down like an invisible weight. Mother didn't respond immediately. Her fingers tightened around her napkin, twisting it into knots, but her face remained impassive. Finally, she looked up, her gaze meeting Margaret's, a flicker of something raw and weary in her eyes. "It was never supposed to come to this," she began, her voice so low that I had to lean forward to hear her. "Everything we did was to protect you." "Protect us from what?" Martin's voice was a low murmur, yet filled with a steely edge that I'd never heard before. "From some imagined danger? Or from the truth about yourselves?" Mother's gaze flickered to Father, who was staring intently at his hands, his fingers still tapping that strange, slow rhythm on the table. There was a weariness about him, a look of defeat that I'd never noticed before. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded distant, as if he were speaking from some place far removed from the present. "We made choices," he said slowly, "choices that we believed were right at the time. But as with all things, there were consequences." The room fell silent again, each of us absorbed in our own thoughts, trying to piece together fragments of a story that none of us fully understood. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting long shadows across the walls, and for a moment, it felt as if those shadows were reaching out to us, pulling us deeper into the darkness that surrounded our family. And then Mother spoke, her voice calm, almost resigned. "It was the land," she said. "This house, this place, it changes you. We thought we could make a life here, thought we could create something safe, something lasting. But there's a price to be paid for living in a place like this." Her words were cryptic, yet there was something in her tone that sent a shiver down my spine. I looked around at my siblings, wondering if they felt it too. The sense that we were standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable, a secret that had been hidden from us our entire lives. Margaret's face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and horror. "You're saying that this house did something to you? That it changed you?" Her voice trembled slightly, and for a moment, she looked like a child again, frightened and vulnerable. Father nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the flickering firelight. "It doesn't make sense," he admitted, "but yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. We felt it from the beginning. This place has a power, an influence that's hard to explain. It whispers to you, makes you see things that aren't there, makes you doubt yourself." I felt a chill wash over me, the realization sinking in like a stone in my gut. All those times I'd felt uneasy in the house, the strange shadows in the corners of my vision, the inexplicable sense of being watched. I'd always thought it was my imagination, a trick of the mind. But now I wasn't so sure. Martin's expression hardened, a look of determination settling over his features. "So you just gave in?" he asked, his voice laced with contempt. "You let this place change you, and you kept it from us, hoping we'd never find out?" Mother's face softened, a glimmer of sadness in her eyes. "We tried to protect you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "But there are some things that you can't protect anyone from." Her words felt like a confession, an admission of guilt that cut through the air like a knife. We sat in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, the weight of our family's secrets pressing down on us like a heavy fog. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows, a reminder of the danger lurking just beyond the walls of our home. For the first time, I felt a surge of anger, a deep resentment toward the people who had raised me, who had kept me in the dark all these years. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to force them to tell us everything they had hidden from us. But as I looked around the table, at the weary faces of my parents, at the haunted expressions of my siblings, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The fragile bonds that held us together had been shattered, and there was no going back. The air around the table had changed, thick with an unspoken tension that none of us dared to break. I could feel the gravity of every glance exchanged, every sharp intake of breath. It felt as though we were teetering on the edge of a chasm, our family's carefully crafted foundation cracking beneath us. In my mind, I replayed Father's words, Mother's somber expression, wondering what other secrets they had woven into the fabric of our lives. It was Margaret who finally shattered the silence, her voice trembling but resolute. "So, we've been living here all these years under the weight of something none of us understood? Some power that none of us could see." She looked at each of us in turn, her eyes pleading for some hint of shared understanding. My father raised his gaze, his face etched with a weariness that seemed almost otherworldly. "I tried to leave once," he murmured, almost as if speaking to himself. "Years ago, I packed our bags, ready to take us far from here. But this place has a way of holding on to you, tethering you to its darkness. I could feel it then, the pull of it, and I chose to ignore it." His words sent a ripple of dread through me, each syllable sinking deeper into my mind like stones into water. I had seen glimpses of this darkness over the years. Shadows shifting in empty rooms, muffled footsteps echoing in the night. But I had always brushed it aside, telling myself it was nothing more than my imagination. "Why didn't you tell us?" Martin's voice was low, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Why let us grow up here? Let us think this was normal?" My mother's hands rested on the table, her fingers tracing invisible lines on the worn wood. "We thought we were protecting you," she said softly, her voice laced with regret. "Protecting you from what we knew, from what we'd seen. But the truth is, this place has a way of twisting everything, of turning even the smallest fear into something unrecognizable." Her words hung heavy in the air, an unspoken admission that there were things in our family's past, things they had hoped would remain buried. As I watched them, I felt a strange mixture of anger and sorrow, a sense of betrayal that seemed almost too vast to comprehend. "Do you remember?" Margaret said suddenly, her voice barely audible, "the old cellar?" Her gaze was distant, her mind clearly elsewhere. "I used to hear things down there, whispers, scratching sounds. I thought it was just my imagination. But now—" She trailed off, her words swallowed by the silence that had settled over us like a shroud. The cellar was a place we rarely spoke of, a dark, musty space at the far end of the house that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. As children, we had dared each other to go down there, each of us trying to outlast the others in the murky darkness. But as we grew older, we avoided it altogether, sensing that there was something in its depths that was best left undisturbed. Mother's gaze flickered to Margaret, her face paling slightly. "We kept the cellar locked for a reason," she said, her voice edged with a quiet intensity. "There are things in this house, things that should remain undisturbed." A silence settled over us, filled with the weight of things left unsaid. I felt my pulse quicken, a growing sense of unease prickling at the edges of my mind. There was something my parents were holding back, something that lingered in their eyes like a shadow, slipping just out of reach. I forced myself to speak, my voice unsteady. What did you see in the cellar?" For a moment, neither of them responded. Father's gaze was fixed on the table, his fingers tracing slow, deliberate circles on the wood. Mother, however, looked at me directly, her eyes dark and searching, as if weighing whether to share what she knew. "There are memories in that place," she said finally, her voice barely above a murmur. "Memories of things long forgotten, things this house has absorbed over the years. The cellar, it's where they linger, waiting." I felt a shiver race down my spine, my mind racing with images of dark, ghostly figures lurking in the shadows of that forbidden space. The idea that our home could hold such memories, that the walls themselves were steeped in something unspeakable, was almost too horrifying to comprehend. Martin's jaw clenched, his gaze hardening. "So, what are we supposed to do?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Just sit here and pretend everything's fine? While this thing holds us hostage?" Father finally looked up, his expression bleak. "It's not that simple, Martin. Leaving this place isn't as easy as it sounds. There's a part of us now woven into our very being. And if we're not careful, it will consume us completely." A sense of hopelessness washed over me, each word striking me like a physical blow. For the first time, I realized the full weight of our situation, the depths of the darkness that had enveloped our family. We were bound to this place, held captive by forces beyond our control, and there was no escaping its grasp. As we sat there in silence, I could feel the walls closing in around us, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The whispers we had tried so hard to ignore, the secrets we had buried deep within ourselves. They were all coming to the surface now, and there was no turning back. In that moment, I understood what my parents had been trying to protect us from, the horror that lurked in the corners of our minds, waiting for its chance to strike. And as I looked into the haunted faces of my family, I knew that we were all trapped, bound by the same darkness that had consumed this place for generations. As the weight of our family's shared history pressed upon us, I felt the house shift, as though it, too, was finally acknowledging the secrets we had buried. The walls seemed to tighten, their surfaces cracked and worn, like a skin stretched too thin over something vast and unknowable. Outside, the sounds of approaching footsteps grew faintly louder, a steady, ominous rhythm that served as a reminder of the outside threat. Yet, as I looked around at my family, I couldn't help but feel that the real danger lay within these walls. Father cleared his throat, his gaze fixed firmly on the candlelight flickering between us. There was a time, he began, his voice brittle, when I believed that the darkness here could be tamed, contained. I thought, if I ignored it, if I refused to acknowledge it, it might pass over us, leave us untouched. He paused, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for his glass. But I was wrong. All it did was grow stronger, feeding off our fear, our silence. Mother's eyes glistened in the dim light, her face a mask of anguish. We were fools to think we could control it. This house has a life of its own, a will that bends and shapes everything within it. And it's waited, patiently, quietly, for us to falter. A chill crept over me, the implications of their words settling deep in my bones. I had always known there was something unusual about this house, some indefinable quality that set it apart. But to hear my parents describe it as a living, breathing entity, something that had quietly observed and manipulated us over the years, was almost too terrifying to accept. "It's not just the house," Martin interjected, his voice taut with barely suppressed rage. "It's us. We're all bound to this place in ways we can't explain. And every secret we've hidden, every lie we've told, this house has taken it in, twisted it, made it part of itself." I looked at Martin, the bitterness in his words cutting through the thick silence. He had always been the skeptic, the one who dismissed the strange occurrences in our home as mere figments of imagination. But now, even he seemed shaken, his voice betraying a flicker of fear. Margaret, seated beside me, leaned forward, her voice a whisper that barely broke the stillness. "Do you think it's listening to us now?" She glanced around the room, her eyes wide with dread. "Do you think it knows what we're planning?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. A part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, of sitting here, speculating on the sentience of a house. And yet, in the depths of my heart, I knew that Margaret's fears were not unfounded. There was a sense of presence here, something that lingered in the shadows, waiting, watching. Father's gaze turned to the window, where the faint glow of torchlight flickered through the trees. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice barely audible. "If we're going to survive this night, we need to trust one another. No more secrets, no more lies." But the words felt hollow, an empty promise that could not erase years of buried resentment and deceit. I wanted to believe him, to cling to the hope that we could overcome the darkness within us and the threat outside our doors. But I knew, deep down, that trust had already been shattered, replaced by a gnawing suspicion that lingered in the air like a poisonous fog. And then, as if summoned by our silence, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. I froze, my heart pounding, as the creak of the floorboards grew louder, closer. We exchanged terrified glances, each of us straining to listen, our breaths held in fearful anticipation. The footsteps halted just beyond the dining room door, and a cold, oppressive silence settled over us. We waited, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe, as the tension mounted, filling the room like a thick, suffocating fog. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound ceased, leaving only the faint crackle of the candle's flame to fill the silence. We looked at each other, a mixture of relief and dread reflected in our eyes, knowing that whatever had stopped outside that door was far from finished with us. My mother's hand found mine beneath the table, her fingers trembling as they clung to me. "We need to stay together," she murmured, her voice a fragile thread in the darkness. "Whatever happens, we face it together." I nodded, forcing myself to breathe, to calm the relentless thudding of my heart. But as I looked around at my family, at the haunted expressions etched on their faces, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already lost, that the darkness that had claimed this house had already taken root within each of us. And in that moment, I understood that survival would come at a cost, one we might not be willing to pay. The room felt smaller, as though the walls were closing in around us. The air had a peculiar weight to it, pressing down on my chest with a silent insistence that made it hard to think. My family sat around the table, each face set in shadow, and I wondered if I was truly seeing them for the first time. Were these expressions etched in fear, or was it something else? It occurred to me suddenly and sharply that maybe they were all waiting for someone else to break the silence, to voice what none of us wanted to admit. Father's eyes were fixed on the candlelight, his gaze unwavering, almost as if he were hypnotized by it. He had always been a man of order, of discipline, expecting the same from all of us, but tonight his control had begun to fray. I watched as he lifted his hand, slowly and deliberately, holding his glass aloft as if to make a toast. "To the truth," he said, his voice low and resolute. "If this is our final meal together, then let's not leave anything unsaid." The glass shook slightly in his hand, and for a moment he seemed almost vulnerable. I could see the hesitation in his eyes, the struggle to maintain his dignity, his sense of control. And then, just as quickly, the moment passed, replaced by an expression I had seen countless times. Cold, guarded, as though he were a fortress unto himself. Martin scoffed, a bitter sound that shattered the quiet like glass. "Truth? Since when did the truth matter to this family? We've been hiding things from each other for years. What's the point now?" His eyes flicked to each of us, a look of disdain lingering on his face. Mother looked down, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her knuckles white against her skin. She didn't speak, but I could sense the tension radiating from her, as if she were holding back words that had been waiting to be unleashed for years. It was Margaret who finally broke the silence. Maybe it's not too late," she said softly, her voice barely a murmur. She looked around the table, her gaze lingering on each of us. "Maybe if we could just forgive each other, we might have a chance." Her words hung in the air, delicate and hopeful, and for a brief, fragile moment, I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that forgiveness could mend the cracks that ran through us, that it could be enough to save us from whatever darkness lay beyond those walls. But then Father laughed, a hollow, humorless sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Forgiveness? After everything that's been said and done? Don't be naive, Margaret. Some things can't be forgiven." Margaret's face fell, her hope fading as quickly as it had come. She looked down at her hands, her expression clouded with something I couldn't quite place. Regret, perhaps, or maybe even shame. I wanted to say something, to reach across the table and offer some small comfort, but the words caught in my throat. In that moment, I felt like a stranger in my own family, an outsider looking in, watching as the people I had known all my life unraveled before my eyes. The footsteps in the hallway began again, louder this time, as though whoever or whatever was out there had grown bolder. They paused just beyond the door, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting, as though the slightest movement might shatter the fragile truce that held us all together. Then, with a slow creak, the door began to open. A shadow stretched across the floor, long and dark, pooling at the edge of the table like a silent threat. I felt my heart race, the terror clawing its way up my throat as the figure stepped into the room. It was an old man, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes hollow and unfocused. His clothes were worn and tattered, as though he had walked for miles through some wasteland to reach us. He looked at each of us in turn, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than the others, and I felt an inexplicable chill, a sense that he somehow knew me, saw me in a way that no one else ever had. "Forgive me for intruding," he said, his voice a raspy whisper that seemed to echo in the silence. "But I've come a long way, and I need a place to rest." Father's face hardened. His jaw clenched as he studied the stranger. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. "What do you want?" The old man didn't answer right away. He seemed to consider the question, as though the answer was buried deep within him, waiting to be unearthed. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft, almost mournful. "I'm just a man, trying to find his way home." There was something in his words, a kind of sadness that resonated with me, as if he carried a burden too heavy for one soul to bear. I wanted to reach out to him, to offer him some small comfort, but fear held me in place, a silent spectator to the unfolding scene. Martin scoffed, his disdainful gaze fixed on the old man. "And why should we believe you? For all we know, you could be one of them." The old man's eyes flickered, a hint of something dark and unsettling passing across his face. "Believe what you will," he said quietly, "but the truth has a way of finding us, whether we like it or not." His words lingered in the air, a quiet reminder of the secrets we had tried so hard to bury. And in that moment, I realized that the danger we faced was not just outside these walls, but within them, a part of us woven into the very fabric of our lives. The old man took a step back, his gaze fixed on me one last time before he turned and disappeared into the shadows. And as the door swung shut behind him, I felt a sense of unease settle over me, a gnawing certainty that we were not alone, that we had never been alone. As I looked around the table, at the faces of my family, I knew that whatever was coming for us would demand a reckoning, a confrontation with the truths we had tried so desperately to ignore. And in the silence that followed, I understood that our final meal had only just begun. After the stranger left, the silence at the table felt like an unwanted guest, settling heavily upon each of us. I could sense my family, every one of them, grappling with thoughts they didn't dare voice aloud. That brief visit had left an unsettling mark, a reminder that our house, our gathering, was far from untouched by what lay beyond. I glanced at my father, hoping for a sign of the man who had always kept us steady. He was staring at his plate, his hand gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked like he wanted to speak, but some invisible barrier held him back. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. Real, raw fear, and it rattled something inside me. If even he was shaken, what hope did the rest of us have? The candlelight flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls like silent phantoms. It was Margaret who finally spoke, her voice soft but unyielding. "Do you think he'll come back?" she asked, looking at each of us, her expression unreadable. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her that the old man was nothing more than a wanderer caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But something in me knew it would be a lie. He had left behind a sense of unease, as if he'd opened a door that could never be closed again. "We don't know who he was," Father replied, his voice strained, almost angry. "And it doesn't matter. He's gone." But his words didn't soothe anyone. I could see it in the way Martin avoided looking at any of us, his gaze fixed on a single point on the table, as if he could will himself away from the room if he stared hard enough. Mother's hands shook as she reached for her glass, and I wondered what memories might be troubling her, what secrets she had been holding so tightly to her chest for all these years. Her face was pale, her expression distant, as if her mind had drifted to some far-off place where none of us could reach her. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember the old stories? About the house at the edge of town? How they said people would go there and never come back?" I hadn't thought about those tales in years. As children, Margaret and I had huddled in the dark, telling each other those same ghostly legends, daring each other to walk closer to the edge of town and see if we could glimpse the house everyone whispered about. But those were just stories, things to thrill and terrify us before we went to sleep. "A house like that doesn't just disappear," Mother continued, her voice shaky. "Places like that, they stay like scars on the land." Father's face tightened. "Enough of this nonsense. We don't need ghost stories right now." But his words held little conviction, and I saw the way his eyes flickered toward the door, as if he half expected to see that old man's shadow there, waiting just out of sight. The candlelight dimmed for a moment, and we all looked up, startled. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, curling around us, pressing closer with an almost palpable weight. And suddenly, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that the house itself was listening, waiting for something to be revealed, a truth none of us wanted to face. Martin was the first to stand, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh, grating sound. "I'm done with this," he muttered, looking around the table, his gaze defiant. "I'm not sitting here pretending everything is fine while we wait for whatever's out there to come for us." Father rose too, his face set in a hard line. "Sit down, Martin. We stay together. We stay here." Martin's eyes narrowed, his hands clenching at his sides. "Why? So we can all end up like them?" He gestured wildly toward the window, as if the horrors outside were lurking just beyond the glass, waiting for us to let our guard down. A heavy silence followed, and I felt the weight of Martin's words settle over us like a shroud. None of us dared look at each other, as if acknowledging the truth in his statement would bring it to life. Then, as if on cue, there was a sound from somewhere deep within the house. A faint creak, a shuffling that seemed to come from the walls themselves. We all froze, the tension stretching between us until it felt like it might snap. Margaret's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She reached for my hand under the table, her fingers cold and trembling. And as I held on to her, I realized just how fragile our family was, How easily we could break under the weight of our own secrets. Father moved toward the door, his steps slow and deliberate, as if he were preparing himself for whatever lay beyond it. He placed his hand on the doorknob, glancing back at us with a look that was both a warning and a farewell. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and firm, and before any of us could protest, he opened the door and stepped into the darkness beyond. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and the silence that followed was absolute. We sat there, waiting, each of us gripped by our own private fears, our own buried memories. And in that silence, I realized that the true horror lay not outside, but within, woven into the very fabric of our lives, waiting to be unearthed. I didn't know what Father would find out there, or if he would come back. But as I looked around the table at the faces of my family, I knew that whatever happened, we would never be the same. We waited. The silence deepened until it became almost a presence of its own. Something thick and oppressive, pressing against us, filling the room with an unbearable weight. None of us dared to move, each trapped in our own corner of dread. Every creak of the floorboards, every shifting shadow seemed to grow sharper, and though the candlelight flickered dimly, it could no longer hold back the sense of darkness that seemed to settle upon us. Time passed in stifling, agonizing slowness. Father hadn't returned, and though I wanted to believe he would, a part of me knew he was lost to us. He had stepped beyond that door into the unknown, leaving us here to confront whatever was left within our own walls. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. Her face was pale, eyes hollow, the earlier spark of rebellion gone. "What if this is it?" she whispered. "What if this dinner, this night, is all we have left?" I wanted to tell her it wasn't true, that we would survive this, that somehow the world would right itself and we would go on. But the words died in my throat. I didn't believe them, and I couldn't lie to her. The truth was, I felt it too, that ominous certainty that we were part of something we couldn't escape, a fate that had been sealed long ago. In the stillness, Mother's voice came, soft and almost wistful, as though she were remembering something distant. "Maybe it was always like this," she murmured. "Maybe we were meant to come to this night. Everything we've kept hidden. Maybe this was the only way it could end." Her words hung in the air, resonating with something deep within me. I looked around the table at the faces of my family, people I thought I knew, and saw them anew. The resentment, the secrets, the unresolved pain. Everything had been waiting for this moment, this night, and in a sick, twisted way, it felt like a kind of justice. Martin's gaze was fixed on the window, his face blank but his body tense, as if he were ready to run. "Do you think they'll come for us?" he asked, his voice barely a murmur. None of us answered. The truth was, it didn't matter anymore. The fear outside, the terror we had spent so long avoiding, felt insignificant next to the unease that had always been here with us, lying dormant under years of silence and secrets. We had spent our lives pretending we were something more, something unbreakable, but now it was all laid bare. As the night wore on, we sat in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Whatever was outside, whatever might come, was beyond our control. We could hear the faint sounds, an echo of footsteps, the rustling of something moving in the dark. But it was all far away, removed, almost unreal. I realized, in that moment, that the terror wasn't outside. It was here at this table between us. We were trapped, not by what lay beyond these walls, but by what we had brought into this house over a lifetime. And now there was no escaping it. One by one, The candles burned down to stubs, their light fading, leaving us in shadow. The house creaked and sighed, as though it too were weary of holding our secrets, our fears. And as the last candle guttered out, I felt a strange, quiet acceptance settle over me. Whatever happened now, it didn't matter. We were already lost, bound to each other by the weight of our unspoken truths. In the end, it wasn't the night, the shadows, or the creeping unknown that claimed us. It was the darkness we had carried with us all along.